For though we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not the weapons of the world. Instead, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We tear down arguments and every presumption set up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
Greetings, you're listening to Cantus Firmus. My name is Cody Cook, and I've asked two guests here today, Daniel Sinclair, a Christian conservative, and Chris Criminger, a Christian progressive, to talk about their faith, their political values, and how those two things relate. First of all, I'd like to hear you both tell us a little bit about yourselves. I'll start with Chris, because alphabetically you come first. So tell me a little about your background, both as a Christian, and then also kind of how you started to connect that with your politics.
Well, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, very conservative, and been a pastor in the Independent Christian Church now for 40 years this year, and been a conservative most of my life. I think things probably started changing for me, especially about 7-8 years ago. And it's interesting that older Democrats than me would say that in the 1960s the Democratic Party left them, and I felt like 7-8 years ago the Republican Party left me. And I just saw the Republican Party just doing a lot of things that I disagreed with. And as I progressed in my understanding about biblical justice and social issues, there's some things on both sides that there's some problems, but I definitely don't see myself aligned with the conservative Christian values, especially that I see today on social media. It's, if they're right, then I guess I'm left. And I would say that some scriptures that really, for me, show my theology is all the way throughout the Old Testament. You see Israel being an oppressed group, nation, and empires oppressing them. And then Israel becomes like an empire, and they start oppressing other people, and they get in trouble with God. And then you come all the way to, Mary's song that she gives about what the Savior is going to bring down the mighty and the powerful and the strong and lift up the weak and the humble and the lowly. And then you got Jesus' first sermon, where it's about setting captives free and bringing freedom to people, and I believe in every area of life. And then you got the book of Revelation, my lands, which I see as a very subversive book about how the Roman Empire is basically, everything that Jesus is the one who says, we call him what? We call him Lord and King, the Son of God, and Savior of the world. And that's exactly what Caesar called himself. And those were all titles of the empire. So I see Jesus' kingdom ethics and call it the kingdom of God politics as very different than the world's politics. What best represents justice and mercy and love at this point in our history. So that'd be a quick brief.
All right. Well, what's interesting is as a libertarian here, I find it interesting that I felt like I agreed with just about everything you said, but I, of course, would look at a lot of these issues very differently. So I'm wondering when Daniel gives his viewpoint, libertarians are sort of said to be those kind of people who are somewhere between the right and the left sometimes. I wonder if I'd like to hear your positive case, Daniel, for why you think conservatism is connects better with your Christian values, and Yeah, so I'll let you do that.
Well, let me tell you briefly. I came from an agnostic scientist family and became a Christian in my early 20s. And I was involved with a very cult-like conservative movement, which caused me to leave Christianity after about 10 years. I spent 8 years searching for truth and healing in places like psychology, A Course in Miracles, Buddhism, yoga, all of them which helped me. But I did return to Christ because the superiority of the Christian worldview and a more healthy view of Christianity really is extraordinarily appealing and hard to argue against in my mind. I went to, right now I'm getting a master's in theology, but I did spend 3 or 4 semesters at Fuller Theological when I started my master's. And of course, they're very center left. And so they exposed me to a few ideas which really helped me. One of them was the idea of the evangelical center. A bunch of guys from the evangelical left, like Ron Sider and Campolo and those guys, they might be considered progressive. They basically said, look, we share a lot of values with conservatives. It's just that we need a complete list, not our half of the list and not their half of the list. So they made a list along with the National Association of Evangelicals called For the Health of the Nation. And they have 8 social priorities listed. The top 3 are very conservative. They're like sanctity of life, value of the nuclear family, free speech rights. In the middle, somewhere there is poverty, because we're all concerned about poverty. And then the bottom half is like racial reconciliation, creation care, things like that. So I think, you know, we all have a label attached to ourselves in this discussion, but I'm sure we all have our own variation of which, you know, how severe we are. You know, not all libertarians are pro-choice. Not all libertarians support, you know, the legalization of all drugs, but they are government minimalists in some sense. And I guess the main difference I have with progressivism is the priority of those issues. Like, is race, I mean, obviously race relations seem to be at the top of the list right now. And for many people, it's creation care and global warming. I don't think those are the right priorities, although we agree that they might be priorities. And the other difference I have with most progressives is the means to those ends. Primarily, I don't think the government is or at least coercive government through prohibitions or through provision through redistribution of money is the right means to solving those problems. And I think that's probably the main place where I would disagree with progressives.
Well, once again, I find that I agree with pretty much everything you said. So,
Well, maybe the devil's in the details, you know?
Yeah, it sure is. Well, so
It is.
maybe it would be helpful to kind of define our terms a little bit. So I'm going to give you, I guess, kind of how I've thought about the difference between conservative and progressive, and you can tell me if you think I'm onto something, or if it's for you, there's something else at the heart of these movements. So it seems to me that like a lot of people will try to define conservative and progressive on the basis of policy. But since policy positions change, you know, for example, the Democrat and Republican parties have switched on their immigration views from 30 years ago. That doesn't seem like the best place to start. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, has done some interesting work connecting these movements with different kind of meta ethics. So he'll point out that while progressives often think of conservatives as lacking a moral interest in compassion and social justice, the reality is that conservatives carry those concerns, but they balance them out with other traditional moral foundations like loyalty, sanctity, and authority. Another distinction that's been made was one by the economist Arnold Kling, and he argued that conservatives are primarily concerned about order and progressives are concerned about oppression. And I think that also has some value in sorting out how both sides look at the issues of our day, especially if you look at something like police brutality. But I guess I think the best definitions could probably be found in the names of the movements themselves. So progressives basically want to go full steam ahead in shaking off bad traditions, which hold society back from moral advancement. And in contrast, conservatives look to conserve the accumulated wisdom in tradition and are anxious about making drastic changes that could disrupt the social order and shake off something that was actually really worthwhile. So there's an example that's used of when you're building a house, some walls are cosmetic and some walls are necessary to keep the structure up. And I think conservatives fear that a progressive is going to come in and take down a wall that was actually necessary to keep the house or the society together. And so for me, that's how I kind of see those two movements functioning. But I'd be interested in hearing if you guys think that that's a correct assessment or if there's something that I'm missing. And I let Chris go first, so I'll let Daniel go first this time.
Thank you. You know, I do have to say I somewhat agree with Chris on the Republican Party drifting from traditional conservatives. You know, I don't think there's a strict alignment there anymore, if there ever was. But for instance, I think the position on immigration has become very hardline and not compassionate at all. And I don't think, you know, I think I miss George Bush's compassionate conservatism quite a bit. You know, not providing a path to citizenship for people seems a little unkind to me. So, but as far as your characterization, I think it's pretty correct. Conservatives want to conserve what has worked, and they rely on traditional, you know, sexual mores and things like that. And progressives, well, I don't know how I would define progressives. Maybe Chris can do that better than me.
I would just say, first of all, Daniel, I love what you said about, you know, the centered of evangelicals trying to have a balance. And I will say at one time that seems to be true, but boy, there's a big pull towards one direction, it seems. And that is, if anything sounds like it's progressive, it must be bad. And for example, it's like care for the earth. That just seems to be a non-issue for many Christians here, especially where I live in the Midwest. Very conservative, evangelical. They could care less about what happens with creation and the world. It's just not even on the radar. And there's some of us, it's like, it should be on the radar, people. It should be on the radar. Problem is we see that there are certain foundations or norms that made up this country, but they continue to evolve and change, to changing needs of society, changing, you know, spiritual. I'll just call it from a Christian perspective, a spiritual evolving. That is, for growth, there's always change. And so I'm kind of like Jesus, where he says, take out treasures old and new. And I think they're both important. And so there's something, I think there's a lot more I find attractive with progressive trying to be compassionate to the poor, compassionate to the needy, compassionate to minorities, compassionate to the foreigner, which within the scriptures themselves. And like Daniel's saying, I've been frustrated as more of a progressive saying, whatever happened to conservative, compassionate conservatism? And so I just want to say, Daniel, you're renewing my faith. You're renewing my faith.
Let me tell you, let me turn up the heat where I think we're a little different, or I differ with progressivism. It comes down to priorities. Like, for instance, I don't think there's a global warming crisis, but the problem with progressivism is it gins everything up. See, I told you I was turning up the heat into a crisis for political manipulation and prioritization. And so, while I think creation care is important, I don't think that's our top crisis. I think even with race relations, it may be worse than most old white guys think. And there may be more, you know, systemic racism, but I think the crisis is ginned up by the narrative and not by the reality of what's actually happening in the world. Now, in China and India, maybe they do have climate issues, the way they pollute. I agree with that. But I think the way things are prioritized by crisis, and conservatives do this as well sometimes, we don't have an accurate view of what's really important and threatening to mankind. I think the priorities are out of whack. And then what happens is if we go on to use draconian governmental policies to deal with those crises, now we're having bigger government, more taxes, more regulations, more things you can't do. And that's where I'm more conservative, even to some extent libertarian, although not entirely. That's my view on that.
Well, Daniel, I guess just kind of speaking broadly, what would you say is so good about tradition?
Well, wisdom is the accumulated knowledge of what works in reality. And some things should not be reconsidered lightly. I mean, the nuclear family, for instance, we've done enough experiments, I think, to know that even though we do need a community as well to help support the nuclear family, so we're not just raising our children, in the tribe or in the home, there's a combination there. But I think, again, the priorities matter. I think certain things are based on biological realities that we disregard to our own harm, and even moral realities. If you believe there's a natural moral law built in, those things have been observed over years. And when a new human comes on the scene, if they don't know that, they're going to try to reinvent the wheel and hurt themselves and a lot of other people if they don't learn from the wisdom of what's gone before. And I think that progressivism is often guilty of throwing wisdom to the wind when they see abuses. And I wonder if they're more susceptible to statist solutions.
Well, so I'll say something kind of positive about conservatism. I was just looking at something Edmund Burke, who is often thought of as kind of the father of conservatism. He had spoke of prejudices, which is basically a negative word nowadays, as these kind of prejudgments that are built into us by social conditioning that help us to make quick decisions, we don't necessarily have to rethink the wheel all the time. Sometimes it's beneficial to just sort of, to make assumptions about wisdom, what's wise based on what our culture said, and sometimes those things are there for a reason. And that's essentially what I think conservatism is arguing. And I think of Tom Wolfe's article, The Great Relearning, where he was talking about Berkeley during the 60s. And there are all these kind of new experiments with living together and hygiene and sexual mores. And all these doctors in Berkeley were talking about all these diseases that hadn't been around since the Middle Ages that were coming back up because we kind of stamped them out by developing these kind of new ways of living together. And so by sort of taking down these, these structural walls, something very negative was happening. On the other hand, there are also a lot of examples of things that we hold on to that really don't make any sense and are bad for everyone. So I think of slavery or segregation. And so I guess moving kind of into that direction, I might ask Chris, what's so good about moving forward? Why should we be so interested in progress?
Well, you can take so many different issues and say it had a good idea, but the original concept of it wasn't reality. For example, all men are created equal. We say we want to be original consciousness. That's the conservative view. And the Constitution basically said Native Americans didn't even count. And African Americans, because of the way the South political and the North and everything, they weren't even fully counted, only a certain percent. And so things have evolved. I mean, everybody would now, when they would say humans, people, men and women, and people of minorities have full human rights. In our modern day, we all believe that, mostly, even if we don't always act like it. But there's been an evolving of our Constitution of what the original people said. And so there's kind of like the beginning stage, but there's been growth and evolution that's even happened with understanding how that should work. My land, the Supreme Court keeps on reinterpreting the Constitution over and over and over. But a big difference to me between conservatives and progressives, and I'm just talking generally. I mean, Daniel may not even fit on this. I'm not talking about Daniel here. I'm just talking about what I see is conservatives like to focus on personal sin. And to me, they do not take corporate, institutional, systematic sin seriously enough. I see it all the time where it's like, there's no such thing as institutional racism. There's not. There's no, they'll talk about sin and then I'll talk about structural sin. And it's like, it doesn't even register with many of them. And I find that problematic because there's a level of sin that affects our lives personally and what we do and say. And then there's what I call structural evil, the principalities and powers. And progressives, I think, are more in tune to society's structural evil and how that is dehumanizing people. So conservatives focus on the divinity of Christ, and a lot of progressives are focusing on the humanity of Christ. Not that they don't believe in the divinity of Christ, but they're focusing on saying, if Jesus was the perfect human, how come we can't be more human to one another? And so it's crazy to me where it's like, you got Christians now divided between politics, Republican and Democrat. You got Christians divided on social issues. And it's like all these social justice issues of the empire is not good. The oppressed people should be tried to take care of. I look at the politics of the day of evangelical white conservatives, and I'm like, wow, whatever happened to justice for all? Whatever happened to compassion for the least? And so, there's lots of struggles I see, and I know there's conservatives that look at other conservatives and say, that's not really representing me. And there's progressives that I see saying and doing power moves. Jesus said, don't lord it over. But let me come down to probably the issue that I probably am different than both of you. Because as Daniel's a conservative, smaller government, this is what changed for me. I used to be where you guys are. And I don't mean that in any type of enlightened, woke, anything. I just mean that's where I started from. I believed in Ronald Reagan's trickle-down economics. I believe smaller government was the better government. And what I've learned is you got these powerful corporations and these powerful people that control so much of our society. And it doesn't matter whether you have government or big government. These people are still going to be controlled and doing everything. And so I don't see it anymore as somehow smaller government is somehow inherently going to be better than bigger government. And so where we spend our money, conservatives really want a strong military nation. We spend 10 times more money than the next nation to us almost. And yet at the same time, it's like, again, social compassion needs for the least. It's like, well, we need to cut those programs. And conservatives are about tax cuts. What do tax cuts do? They raise the national debt. And we haven't had a balanced budget. Conservatives and progressives will both say we don't even talk about balanced budget anymore. Last time we had a balanced budget was with Bill Clinton, and he had $1 trillion excess. And then what does a conservative evangelical white Christian like George Bush II do? We got 9/11, which certainly was a crisis, and there that went. Although, Afghanistan was just, let's hit them because Saudi Arabia really was a culprit, but hey, they're our friends, so we can't go after them. And then it was like, somehow we've got to go after all these other countries. And so we went after Iraq. And if I remember this, Daniel probably remembers this too. Our government had to try to sell us on how can we invade Iraq. So we came up with, they got chemical weapons, they got nuclear capability, they got this, they got, nothing worked. And they finally came up with Operation Freedom. We're going to free the Iraqi people. And then the American people said, yeah, I'm on board for that. Conservatives are about capitalism, which is about the profit motive. I'm not against capitalism, but I say, as a Christian, what about the love motive? And because capitalism doesn't really cater real well to the love motive, although there could be Christian business people that do, but I see it more as an exception. And so I see where the government at times needs to, and because the church has not been helping as much, then the government's been trying to step in at different points. And it's like, everybody wants to know where's the money going? And it's just sad because my heart is, I see a lot of needs out there, a lot of hurting people, and I just want to see them have a better life. Mm-hmm. And so that's just kind of my start.
Sure, yeah, which I think kind of connects with what Haidt said about the compassion, justice, moral foundation being the primary progressive one. But I think what I noticed, though, is you talked a lot about recent policy, which, most of what you said about what conservatives did under Bush wouldn't apply to, conservative non-interventionists and isolationists. But it would, apply to more hawkish Democrats like Kennedy and LBJ. And so I guess part of what I'm interested in this conversation is kind of what's at the root. Because if we can shift and change so much, depending on who's president or, whatever the case may be, I think oftentimes it's who's president, will kind of tell us what we're for or against, or sometimes who the who represents the base. I think Republican Party has become more evangelical friendly because the base changed. And I think the Democrats became more pro-immigration because they lost white labor. And white labor is very concerned about threats to people taking their jobs, which is why Republicans used to be very pro-immigrant, because they said, hey, they're not hurting anybody. It's more labor. It's good. And Democrats said, wait a second. We got to keep these people out. So I'm interested in not necessarily just these specific instances of policy at a given time, but these kind of big picture things.
Cody, can I respond to what Chris said?
Sure.
I think Chris and I agree on a lot of things, and we disagree in other things, of course. I guess that's needless to say. But I agree that, we can minimize government and still have economic monopolies. That where you have these oligarchs that are running the world as well. Any concentration of power, whether it's political or economic, is a problem. But the question is, what is the best solution? So, for instance, we would say, well, capitalism is run on greed and it's not compassionate. What I could tell you that socialism is not compassionate either. It pretends to be, but the real problem is the hearts of men. So the question is, do we want to have more government telling everyone what to do and have more power and corruption that way without liberty, or do we want corruption with liberty under capitalism, and then we take a secondary approach? And I think that's what I'm thinking about it. The primary approach should be one of individual liberty and individual responsibility. That's what a conservative would say. And secondarily, we need to make sure that our systems are just, that our systems are minimal and not abusive. So I would say I'd rather have a small government that also regulates interstate trade, that prevents monopolies, rather than a large socialist government that lacks competition in the economic sector and doesn't lift anyone up and is not economically viable. So I think, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know what Chris would think about that. I mean, I agree with him that people are hurting. I don't agree that we should just do whatever to help them, because certain solutions are not sustainable and they actually violate human dignity, for instance, by not asking people to be responsible and get some skin in the game. Now, there are gray areas, like healthcare is a gray area. I think there should be some provision there, but because individuals have to be responsible or irresponsible, it can't just rely on some big government's compassionate solution, because it doesn't encourage the personal responsibility as well. And we have to build it in such a way that it does, and maybe that there's competition, like a public-private hybrid. I think with education and healthcare is much more important than having either one or the other, because that way you have the benefits of the centralized government, but you also have the benefits of individual responsibility and liberty. And I think that's where progressives jump the shark, is they throw out individual responsibility. Now, I would agree that conservatives don't even acknowledge systemic racism, or they minimize it a lot. But the question is how can we get an accurate reading on that? So for instance, last year, 9 unarmed black men were killed by police, and half of them were attacking the police. They were just unarmed. So is that really systemic racism? Now, there's other ways to measure that. That's just kind of a commonly trotted out piece of data. But I guess what I'm saying is, again, there's this weird crisis thing going on, and then is systemic racism the primary problem, for instance, in the black community? Conservatives would say no. The big determiner is individual virtue, character, and responsibility. Unfortunately, they forget all about systemic racism as an important factor as well. So I think that's where we agree. I think, again, we disagree on the ratio, the priority, and the solution. I'm sorry for rehashing that. I know you want to take the podcast into other topics, but I just want to restate that.
Can I throw the hot potato in now?
Sure.
I agree much of what Daniel's saying, but when he talks about personal character and responsibility and everything, how is it that Donald Trump represents that? Because it seems like that's good, Daniel, because it seems like the majority of conservative Christians are not saying that. And you are a breath of fresh air, because you're looking at it from a bigger Christian perspective, I think. But I'm just like, it blows my mind that, I mean, the truth is, you and I, who've been part of the white evangelical movement, you and I are the minority. Daniel, we're the minority, whether progressive or conservative, we're the minority of not supporting Trump as someone who represents what's best for this country, what represents a Christ-like personality or anything else. And again, most of that comes from conservatives and progressives. I don't like the love-hate relationship that conservatives love the president and progressives hate him. I'm not in for, for anybody hating anybody. But it's like, I find myself living in strange times when I look at the evangelical world in America and go, where in the world are they going down on this train? It makes no sense to me.
I think evangelical support for Trump is a unique and unusual and weird situation. And I think there's a lot to discuss there. We don't have to necessarily do that today, but I am uncomfortable with it, but I'm also comfortable with it in a way that I think the only reason conservatives rally around him is because progressivism has also gotten so polar the opposite that it's this weird reflexive thing, and we're also more willing to overlook his personal faults because we think he's accomplishing our policy ends. And I think that's a new thing. A shift in evangelicalism happened after we attacked Bill Clinton for his moral faults. I think there's a pragmatism that's come into the conservative movement as saying, well, I guess we don't really care about their personal morality as long as they get done what we want them to get done. And I think in some ways, Trump has done that because the GOP gave us lip service like on abortion for years, and Trump supposedly, or seems like he's actually doing something. So I think they're caught in a catch-22 here, and so they're not being critical enough, partly because they're just rallying the troops against the vociferous and sometimes untrue attacks because they perceive Trump as getting things done that even their own dear GOP never did. Now, that doesn't make Trump very savory to me either, but I understand that.
Well, but I think too that there's something we're not acknowledging here, which is the role of groupthink. And we didn't mention, for example, that Biden has been perhaps more credibly accused of sexual assault than Trump has. And yet there were a lot of my progressive friends who said that Trump was simply basically disqualified as a candidate because of that. I have a lot of progressive friends who've talked about, Trump's racism, which I think in particular, if you want to talk about racism toward African Americans, I think the evidence has been kind of weak. It's been implied maybe at times. Whereas I think Biden has said more overtly racist things about Black people than Trump has. And yet I think there's a sense of, well, this is the team and this is our group. And so we excuse it when it's our guy. But when it's the other guy, it's different. And I think that is kind of where this kind of team mentality can really take us pretty far afield. But I guess what I maybe would want to say is maybe getting down to brass tacks a little bit more, or maybe what I should say is what I should ask. And we got into this a little bit. I think Chris kind of opened with this a bit. What does the Bible have to say about politics, about statecraft, about building a social order? Are there certain biblical passages that you guys would appeal to as centering for that? How does your Christian faith inform what you think about statecraft?
You want me to go first?
Sure. It looks like Daniel's taking a minute to find something.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, Amos 5 talks about great Martin Luther King, about justice rolling down like a mighty river. And, there's justice issues all the way through the scriptures. And I think a lot of people love Jesus because his parables, were political. They talked about justice, talked about judges, talked about kings and all these different people. And a lot of times it was talking about unjust judge and unfair crop owners and all kinds of different things. And so, justice is such an important issue. About 5 years ago, I went to a Christian justice conference. It was all 20 and 30-year-olds. And there was just like out of like 800 people, there might have been like 30, 40 people, my age and Daniel's age. And I'm just like, justice issues don't really register with the older Christian generation. It's all about going to heaven when I die. It's all about, keeping the, as a conservative would say, keeping the order of things the same. And it's like people should know their place, and on it goes. And I find that very troubling. And so as someone who has lived in the conservative Christian subculture my whole life, I see a huge disconnect with even conservative Christians, not really concerned about a lot of justice issues, except for the two biggies. If you're going to be prophetic in a conservative church, you say your one sermon against, the gay community, and then you say your one sermon against abortion a year, as if that's somehow being socially prophetic. And for me, that's actually socially pathetic on the way I've seen that handled by pastors my whole life. And so, besides what goes on in the world of politics, it just seems like most Christians are just making up their social ethics. They don't really know the Bible anymore. They're more in tune to either CNN or Fox News or talk radio than they are to what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, or even what Jesus actually said in the Sermon on the Mount. It's like those scriptures just somehow just kind of float around, and it just doesn't apply. And so, but I also agree there are some progressives that take things way too far, especially trying to censor people's voices. I hate patriotic correctness of the right, and I hate the political correctness of the left. And I find both of those disturbing because it's just messed up. But coming back to the pro-life issue, I'm pro-life from womb to tomb. But a lot of conservatives, it's just about the baby being born. After that, they don't really care, it seems to me. I know that's not Daniel, but that is my experience with so many conservative Christians. And it's like, and then we got pro-life president like Bush or Trump, and abortions go up during their presidencies. Yeah, they're trying to talk and trying to do certain things, but in the end of the day, because of the economic problems that lead to abortions actually go up during Republican presidents. And so I just see the conservative Christianity looking at the pro-life issue, which I've almost come to call the pro-birth issue anymore, because it's not, to me, even pro-life anymore. It's pro-birth, as the politicians just fooling Christians on that issue. Daniel knows what has really changed since Roe versus Wade. Of all the Republicans we've had, it's really changed. So Scripture, so there's a practical aspect of, I want to see not only how does Scripture inform our understanding of issues, but also how does it practically work out? I mean, if we're saying I'm for, racial justice, but minorities are being more oppressed by your group, there's a problem there. If I say I'm pro-life and more abortions are happening under my leadership, it's not just what we think, but it's also what actually happens as a result of it. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
So for you, building a social order biblically is ensuring that justice is done for the least of these would be maybe the simplest way to say it, if I were to try to summarize it in a bumper sticker?
I would say yes, and I'm against all kinds of oppression from the right or the left. It doesn't really matter to me, but anybody oppressing anybody, I'm against that. I'm for the dignity and welfare of all humans. And that's just not for this country, but that's globally as well. And so for me, if 50 Americans die because of one thing and 50 Africans die another for something else related, my heart grieves for both of them, and not just, we care about the 50 Americans died, but we don't really care about the 50 Africans that died, in a situation. So that's just my heart. I have a global heart to see justice globally, but I know as a people, and as Daniel said, as statesmanship, we got to be responsible for ourselves first. But also there's no accountability for our institutions anymore. I don't care whether you vote Republican or Democrat. The corporate powers are in place. They've got it all locked up a certain way. I almost think capitalism is more like what I would call capitalism. What conservatives call capitalism is actually what I call corporate socialism. Since socialism is a boogeyman, it's corporate socialism. It's the wealthy that is getting all the advantages. And for 45 years now, whether you're Republican or Democrat, the wealthy people are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And so we obviously have a real problem that goes beyond the parties. We have a real problem with the whole system, to me. And progressives, at least, are challenging the system, where I see a lot of conservatives just saying, we're protecting the system. And I know there needs to be some both and there, but I see a lot more change that needs to happen than conserving on some of that.
Mm-hmm. Challenging the system by trying to make it bigger. No, I'm just kidding. So, Daniel, for you, and you're on mute. I don't know if you noticed that, but there's for you, what would you say is maybe like some centering biblical passages. What do you think the Bible has to say about building a social order? What should that look like?
I think if you study politics, I mean, here's a wonderful book, Uneasy Neighbors, government in the New Testament. And there isn't a clear, I don't think there's necessarily an entirely clear approach that Christians should take. And here he talks about three approaches: subordination, as Paul might teach, which is do what the government says; critical distancing, where Jesus was like, yeah, give to Caesar what's his, and just be focused on the kingdom. Jesus was a bit of an anti-zealot. And then, there's also kind of ethical resistance. But as far as crafting government and what the Bible says, I think we also have to be careful to read too much into or too much out of the Old Testament, which was a theocracy, right? So not everything that they did there is going to apply to us. So I'm still a believer in a minimalist approach. But as a Christian, what I think, I think I agree with Chris that we do have what is essentially a capitalistic socialism, a control center, which takes people's liberties and things away. But the question is, what do we do about it? All right, we make government smaller, and so we've gotten rid of government tyranny. Now we've got this economic oligarchical, tyranny as well. And the government can only do so much to limit that. It can do some, but wherever there's power, the powerful are going to put their, they're going to focus on that. So to some extent, I think the only thing we need is a revival of virtue, which only comes not through government, but through preaching and through living a virtuous life in the culture. So I think there's only so much hope we can have in fixing the system. And I don't mean to be hopeless. I think we should absolutely appeal to justice. And I agree that Christians are unconcerned with a lot of these social, by comparison to a lot of these social justice issues. But I would like to disagree with him on one point. The trope that Christians only care about children from birth, I think is really not true. And what I mean by that is, if you look at who's running the foster agencies, who's adopting, who's running, volunteer and pregnancy centers for the unwed mothers, there's more unwed pregnancy centers in the country than there are Planned Parenthood clinics, which up until recently were getting $500 million a year, $500 million a year, from the government. I mean, my church alone, we do so much with foster children. So I think that's just a misrepresentation of who actually cares. The conservatives are, and Christians especially, are active throughout, birth, adoption, foster care, unwed mothers, homes for battered women, and in the prisons. I mean, come on, who does more prison ministry than the Christians we know? So I think the idea that they're not compassionate or not concerned about the oppressed is kind of a misrepresentation. The reason you can misrepresent them that way is because they're not for government solutions. And unfortunately, because they want to preserve our freedom, they don't recognize the oppression of economic powers. And I think that is a place where we need to not only be prophetic and say, hey, Microsoft, hey, Facebook, hey, Amazon. And what I would like to see is, if we're going to use government solutions, incentives for them to do more good. You can write off money given to charity. You can, if you start a business, you can get tax deductions. So I know they take advantage of this. They're always looking for loopholes. But we can also, I just feel like government is limited in what it can do and what it should do. And I think progressives, they ask the right questions, but kind of like the, what was that movement among Christians? They were kind of like the Rob Bells of the world, that whole movement.
Red letter?
Not red letter.
Emergent?
Yeah, emergent. They ask all the right questions and they end up with all the wrong solutions, because I think they failed to be conservative and recognize what human nature and reality and God and the moral order really are about. And so, Chris, to some extent, I think you've kind of taken what you have seen, which is bad about the conservative movement, but I think you've bought too much of the anti-conservative view that they don't do anything beyond birth. And I want to say one of the reasons they focus so much on abortion is because it's killing innocent people. And I know you said you're against that. And so they kind of prioritize that as a government thing, because we're not asking the government to provide for foster care or anything like that. So I just think it's more appearances than it is actuality as far as who we care about and who cares.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that for a progressive, because progressives are so invested in government solutions, it's almost like the love language of progressives is government involvement. And
but
so
their observations of conservatives are often true.
But I think in the case of abortion, though, I think you're right. The issue is they feel like, well, if you don't want the government involved in this, that, or the other thing, that means you don't care about it. But I think from a conservative or at the very least, like a classical liberal or libertarian perspective, the role of the state is not to give you everything that might benefit you. The role of the state is to stop people from violating your life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness. Right.
But Chris is right. But Chris is right, is that because of our polarized environment, at least, conservatives do minimize certain things or ignore them. And I think that's to our detriment. I mean, for instance, I don't think social structural racism is that big a deal. But when I see the reaction in the public, I start to wake up and think, okay, well, even if it's not, there is certainly a perception that it's real. If not, there's more to it than I had understood. And conservatives are just so slow, and maybe this is just human nature. We're so slow to wake up to a correction to our imbalanced approach. And so, you know, as a sort of a centrist type of person, I think Chris and I would agree on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Daniel, you and I think, are much closer because, you know, I'm probably more on the conservative side of the progressive movement, and you're more on the center of or I should say I'm more on the center versus all the way over on the progressive movement, and you're on the center of the conservative movement, and the other two sides yell a lot louder than we do. As a matter of fact, we try to have civil discourse, and they just get angry, and it's groupthink, like Cody said. And you know, I will say I'm a part. I mean, I do jail ministry. I work with crisis pregnancy centers. I've worked with a lot of those different groups, but my critique is that I find conservative Christians opposing government economic help because their priorities is for a strong military, which that's a whole other Christian issue in itself. Is that what Christians should be prioritizing is the military? From my perspective, I am a follower of the nonviolent Jesus, and so I just see as a trend the economics is hurting people in this country so much, and I come to the conclusion that conservative politics is a way of conserving the status quo, where there's all these people that are falling through the cracks, and it follows the status quo of keeping those in power that are rich and powerful because they're giving the narratives even to both parties. But there's a certain narrative that it's always about, let's divide over conservative and progressive, let's fight between Republicans and Democrats, and we're all doing all this stuff while they're sitting there controlling the narrative, reaping all the benefits, keeping people oppressed. And I really struggle with that because I'm like, things have got to change in this country. And again, for me, to be honest, I pretty much, I always say when you're no longer an evangelical, who you turn your card into. And with the rise of Trump linked to conservative evangelicals, I was like, where do I turn my card in? Because I'm just like, and I know evangelicalism is a global phenomenon that's much bigger than America, but I live in America, and I'm just like, I don't even identify with this anymore with so much of it. I mean, there's, it's like I just saw two elderly conservative evangelical women, lovely women, and they're talking about we have to vote for Trump or our vote is against our country becoming Marxist and socialist. I'm not even sure they really even know what those terms mean. And then they bought into this whole thing that it's like preserving the white way of life to me, the white way of life. And I just think if Trump loses this next election, for example, I think persecution, religious freedoms is going to come less, but it's going to come less because Christians hitched their wagon to Trump. Now there's going to be, if Trump goes down, I think the church is not only going to go down because we're going to lose religious freedoms because people are going to say, if Trump was dangerous, Christians are dangerous. I think that's sad. So, but there's a bunch of us that are more in the center, like you, Cody, and Daniel. But I just look at both sides and I'm going, man, we got to get together as Christians. But it's so polarized now. It's like all I can do is try to show love, because it's like people will stop a conversation if you start talking about progressives or social democracy or anything like that. It's like those are conversation stoppers for a lot of conservative Christians. It's like, I won't even talk to you if that's what you represent. And that's sad. We need dialogues like this, Cody, which I'm so glad that you set up. We need desperately more dialogues like this and more understanding from, I don't really believe in sides, but if you're going to call it two different perceptions, for us to get together and understand each other better. I wish there was 100 times more people like Daniel. I really do. My problem isn't with Daniel. It's with so much of what you got to understand. I live in the place where the KKK started. I live in a state where Trump is going to win by double digits big. I live in Trump land. And it's just like, the mindset of the church around here just totally boggles my mind. It just, there's lots of stuff I wouldn't believe. People will say that people are following Trump like a cult. Oh, you can't go that far with it. I've seen so many Christians do that. I'm like, it seems to be some truth there. And I've seen it's just the power of observation. The more I've gone down, and I'm like, as far as I'm concerned, everybody says we gotta have somebody like Trump in there to conserve religious freedom. And I'm like, I think this is the fastest way we're going to destroy religious freedom in this country. That's my perspective. That there's going to be a backlash for the church and religious freedom because we're trying to lord it over the Gentiles, like Jesus said, don't do it, for religious freedom. And again, we have a president who tries to talk the talk, whatever that means, because I don't even see that, but he doesn't walk the walk. And I'm sure Daniel would agree with a lot of what I'm saying there, but it's the reality I see. I mean, I live in Trump land. I really do. It's the reality I see. I'm glad Daniel doesn't represent that, but it's like, oh, my lands. It just boggles my mind.
Well, I think you're right that the polarization that we're finding with Trump and the right pushes the left further in their own direction. And I think increases the likelihood of, oppression or violence. One thing I guess I'd want to say is, I don't know that I'm necessarily ideologically center, because as a libertarian, people would consider me a radical from the get-go, because the kind of Overton window is, well, what do we want government to do? How much do we want government to do, basically? And I think what I would say is, I think I'm pragmatically centrist, in the sense that I think that even though we disagree on a lot, we still, before you start talking to somebody about their politics, you might find that you like them a lot, that you have a lot in common, that you enjoy spending time with them. These are people that we live with and work with and, shop with, and people in our family. And so I think, to me, I may not be an ideological centrist, but I'm a pragmatic centrist, in that I don't necessarily think that we all need to choose our sides and fight our battles. We don't need to become we don't need to basically start a civil war over the kinds of things that we're disagreeing over. And I guess what I'm, if you're okay with it, I might like to just kind of give a little bit of my perspective and actually get where you think I'm wrong from both of you guys. So, as a libertarian, I'm not really conservative or a progressive. What I essentially think is that the government's primary or perhaps sole concern is to protect our rights to life, liberty, and the free pursuit of happiness, as we read the Declaration of Independence. So I think when we expand the state's role beyond that, we get into trouble. I'm particularly concerned about minimizing force and coercion, I guess you could say. Those are my core values. And I think part of the reason why conservatives and progressives, or that debate between conservatives and progressives, is so charged, is because on some level you both believe in violence. You both believe in using state power and coercion to get what you want, and that's why I think you guys are often so afraid of each other. So what I would say, so I think if you assume like that the law of Moses, stuff we read in the Old Testament, should be the model for statecraft today, if you were to assume that, because I think you can find a lot there that sounds very conservative and a lot that sounds very progressive, depending on what you're looking at, right? But I think in my reading of Scripture, and Daniel said this as well, and you kind of shook your head as well, Chris. These are laws that were for the theocracy of Israel, and I think the Old Testament even tells us that Israelites were held to different standards than the world was held to. The world governments were not expected to emulate Israel's unique moral code, but they were charged with ensuring justice, not oppressing the people with unbearable burdens, things like that. So, excuse me. I think if that's true for Israel, it's even more true for Christians, because our kingdom, according to Jesus, is not of this world, and thus Jesus argued it can't co-opt the world's basically the state's violent methods for itself. So if Christians are not told to make the state Christian, I guess my question would be, what should our hopes for it be? I think we should want a state that is going to protect justice, ensure peace, not oppress, not interfere with the basic freedoms necessary for us to preach and live out the gospel. So I guess if we do owe our primary allegiance to this nonviolent spiritual kingdom, but we have to live peaceably within the earthly nations in which we find ourselves, then we ought to eschew violence, and the state is organized violence. So Christians should not be advocating for the increase of state violence. I think, Chris, you talked earlier about being a progressive because you follow the nonviolent Jesus. But in addition, I think the free sharing and living out of the gospel, which is really, as Christians, our primary focus, requires a society wherein conscience and personal freedom are respected by the state. And since our goal is free expression and uncoerced conversion, we should prefer to live in a free society like the one that libertarians advocate for. And I'll say too, and I kind of got at this earlier, that I think there's this kind of unity and diversity problem that we have, where that breeds suspicion. Part of it's political. I think part of it is, as much as progressives and also myself as a libertarian love immigration, I think what we find is sometimes it becomes less like a melting pot. And, I can't think of a good analogy to come up with, but it becomes one of those things where you have, because we're not unified, we begin to suspect each other. And I think conservatives and progressives make these tensions worse because what essentially they're fighting for is this vision to be forcing everyone through state violence. And I think if we could actually unify a little bit on the sense that we actually do want to see less violence, we do want to see less state violence, we want to see more freedom, so that we can create the kind of communities that we want to see, that progressives and conservatives can create progressive and conservative communities without the use of force and violence, like, Amish and Orthodox Jews do. So I think if we are wanting to solve this unity and diversity problem, I think getting rid of that that stinger, which is state violence, would go a long way to doing that. So that's kind of how I look at some of these questions. Is just basically minimizing violence, following the nonviolent Jesus and recognizing that the state and the church are different things, but for better or for worse, we're stuck with the state. And so if we're going to have it, I think that classical liberal view of what the state should do is the best way to look at it. So I'm sorry, I think I said a lot, but I'd be curious to hear where you guys think maybe I'm missing something.
Hey, Ken, I'm going to have to go here in just a minute. But I just want to say, from a progressive standpoint, that actual violence of any kind, I mean, like, you know, it's crazy for me as a Christian. I'm like, I look at myself as true pro-life. I'm like, I'm not for the death penalty. You know, I'm not for war. I'm not for droning people to death, which Obama was terrible about, which was a really shame. I'm not, you know, our country's been bombing 7 countries since George Bush. George did it. Obama's doing it. Trump's doing it now. We're dropping all these bombs constantly on 7 other countries. You don't really hear anything about the news of it because that's just how it is. And I'm just like, I'm against violence. Now, I think sometimes, Cody, as a libertarian, maybe what you're saying too is coercive moves against people is violence as well. And I don't know how the state operates beyond that. I don't necessarily like it either. But if we're going to be like Israel and says, give us a king, instead of being a theocracy, then we're going to have our government leaders are going to coerce us. In any direction we end up going, they're going to coerce us to some degree. And I will just end with saying this. I'm going to let you and Daniel finish it up. I got family I've got to attend to. But if people like me and Daniel and you, Cody, as Christian brothers in Christ, and other Christians can hold hands together, whatever tendency to the right or the left or the center each of us are, then maybe we could grab a hold of the people on the other side of us. You know, Daniel, you can grab other
Amen.
conservatives, and I can grab other progressives, and Cody, you can grab other libertarians, and kind of like hold that tension to pulling people towards the center.
You know, the
just
problem,
so like, yeah.
Yeah, the problem with centrists is we're not as radical and as noisy as the people on the ends, but maybe we do need to be noisier in appealing to, you know, the better nature of, you know, what we're doing out there, and pull people in, because we're far enough apart that we can iron sharpen iron and make sure we're not, you know, still, you know, maybe I've got some things that are too conservative and you've got a couple that are too progressive or whatever. But if we can stay in contact and bring everyone in away from their extremes, but the problem is we have to be a little more obnoxiously loud, I think. And, you know, somehow, otherwise we're not going to be heard. I don't know. That's just an idea.
I'm just going to end with this. I kind of agree with you, but it's like, I wish that wouldn't have to be the case. You know, it's probably true what you're saying.
I don't know.
But I'm like, you know, our culture is so big into loudness and sound bites, and if we're going to be louder, I hope we're louder with love then. We're louder with love, because a lot of the politics of, especially American politics, wow, you just don't see a lot of compassion and love on either side. And that's sad. You know,
Well, you know, one thing I think a principle that I've learned coming out of an extreme cult-like Christian group in the past was that the best response to an extreme is not the opposite extreme, but it's the balanced truth. And I think when I criticize my conservative friends, I have to acknowledge what they believe is true, but also tell them where they're missing out. And maybe we can do that with each other, and we can say with progressives, here's what's true about what you're saying, but here's what's not true. And maybe as long as we provide the balance, that the reason will start to draw some people in, you know.
Well, Chris, thank you for taking time to do this. I know you got to go, and I thought I heard a dog somewhere. I assume it was your dog.
Yeah, it is. Hey, you guys have been awesome. Daniel, oh, I wish we'd get together in real life. Cody, really appreciate everything that you have said. I know you get a lot of heat on trying to deal with both sides at times. And I also want to say too is, you know, for Christians who support this current president, I love them. I I don't hate Trump like a lot of people, progressive, hate Trump. I don't hate Trump. Um, I'm sad at this year. To be honest, the first 3 years of Trump, I think he did a lot more good than bad. This year, when he was under pressure with so many different things, that's when he really, for me, dropped the ball. Despite all the other faults and stuff. And so, you know, I pray for whoever our leaders are, and in some ways, maybe the Mennonites who don't get into all these political debates and the Quakers, is that the church is supposed to be the alternative society. And sometimes I think the church has lost spiritual power in this country, which is part of the decline. And to get the only power they know how to get back is political power. And I just think whether you're from the right or the left, whether you're conservative or progressive, all the different labels that people give each other, which are not always the best, it doesn't matter. I think there's a tremendous danger for Christians to be relying on the politics of this world as the answer for this world's problems. And I'm sure you guys would be in agreement. I mean, it's like all of us would say it's Christ and his kingdom, and his kingdom goes beyond Republican and Democrat and Libertarian. His kingdom goes beyond a lot of these different things, because the politics of Jesus is just simply different than the politics of the world. And God bless you, brothers. I love you guys, and so great to talk to you.
Thank you, Chris. So Daniel, do you have any parting shots, parting words?
No, I thought, it turns out we're, when you try to get reasonable people on, they're closer to each other than they think, I suppose. But closing shots, I don't know. I think the libertarian position you presented was much closer to conservatism than progressivism, because, again, we're both for a limited state government. But what you didn't mention is that as a progressive, what he's against is one of the abuses of liberty, which is the oppression of economic tyrants, right? And so if you just allow freedom and you don't do anything about that, is that libertarianism that says, you know what, it's a free society. If people are oligarchs, that's the way it works.
Well, so yeah, I mean, traditionally, traditionally, a lot of capitalists have argued that the state has a role in breaking down monopolies.
Right.
Some have argued that without government, without corporate interests being able to co-opt the government, monopolies don't last very long. Which I at least am open to as well as a possibility that maybe the need is not so strong in a libertarian society. But I think, I vacillate a little bit on some days. I feel more like an anarchist, but most of the time I think, I kind of take Paul sort of at his word in Romans 13 when he says the state does have a role, and that God intends for it to exist. It's just, just on a different, we basically don't mix the church with it. They're different things. But yeah, I think as a Christian, I would prefer to live in a state where I'm allowed to live freely and preach the gospel freely, and I don't have the state breathing down my back. And I think to me, that sounds like a libertarian society.
Where I say else we disagree a little bit is, if you look at like the two factors of economic, conservative or liberal, and social economic, right? So on libertarianism, you're probably a minimalist on both economic and social issues, whereas traditionally conservatives are more, they don't mind more intervention on social issues. And so to some extent, I think I'm a little more libertarian than conservative in that aspect, because I think I mean, should we make marijuana legal? I'm on the fence about that. Most libertarians would say absolutely. We should make all recreational drugs illegal because prohibition doesn't do anything, or it creates a black market if nothing else. I don't know. I think I'm not libertarian enough to say that. And as far as nonviolence is concerned, I think God has sanctioned violence in the state. I think Christians can be part of corporate, even retributive justice. I do think we should be peacemakers on an individual level, and at a government level, we should be trying to be making peace, not just making war all the time. The war machine wants money. But I still think it's pretty valid that we have, strong defense, that we walk softly and carry a big stick. Because the reality is Hitlers are out there all the time. And Switzerland is not going to stop them. So I guess in that way, I'm more hawkish in my conservatism.
Well, if the church in Germany was doing what it was supposed to have done, we wouldn't have had to use military might to stop Hitler. Right.
Well, and I agree with that, except that I think that's Pollyannish to expect the church to, well, maybe I'm not saying that right. It's not Pollyannish in that sense. The founders of our country tried to create something based on, I think, a pretty accurate view of human nature. That is, unrestrained liberty or unrestrained power is not good for humans, right? But we need to create at least an architecture in which freedom and justice are both vigorously protected. Mm-hmm. And I think that, think about what is the church doing today that's preventing or not preventing violence, in our streets. I mean, why isn't the church successful in keeping, gangs from killing each other in Chicago? Is it the fact that Christians aren't being Christian enough? Maybe. I mean, it does say he'll heal our land if we return to him, in Chronicles. I don't remember where that is. Second Chronicles, something like
it's
that.
Second Chronicles 7:14.
7:14, yeah. So it definitely behooves. If our nation is going to pot, it's because we're not following God like we ought to and teaching others to do so. I mean, I think I agree with that as the root here. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but yes.
No, but yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I guess as I look at it, the reason why so conservatism and progressivism seem to be orientations toward the past and toward the future. And right. To me, the past and the future are not you can't necessarily say the past is bad and the future is good, or the future is bad and the past is good. And I think that's why I don't think that either viewpoint really captures a proper framework. To me, I think libertarianism says something a little bit different, and it says, well, here are our values, here's what we want to protect, and then put that filter on whatever issue from the past or future you want to, and that's going to work every time. And so I think that it's at least gives you a framework that's rooted in a moral value, which is being against coercion. Whereas conservatism and progressivism are constantly changing because the past and the future are constantly changing in the sense that we're always moving forward somewhere else.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree that conservatism is 100% backwards looking, but that I guess that's the debate: how is conservatism adapting to current circumstances? If it's is it truly looking backwards all the time, or is it just that's its primary mode, and does it have a secondary mode of being pliable in the present? I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read enough about to know officially what that would be like. Like, what is conservatism's approach to the present?
Yeah,
it's probably reinterpreting principle.
Could be. Yeah, I mean, Burke argued essentially that he wasn't against progress, but his essential argument was it was actually not really an evolutionary argument, which is if we sort of look at our hands or arms or our legs, and we say, these serve, or our teeth, for example, and we say, well, look at how they're suited for eating certain things, and and I think what Burke is essentially arguing is that these societal things we've developed came about for a reason, and maybe some of them have become vestigial, and we should cut them off. But essentially, he would say, they developed for a reason. They're probably there for a good reason, and so we should be careful about getting rid of any of these things. Not that we never do, just that we should be.
I don't know if conservatism is that unthinking and relying on tradition. My impression, and maybe that's just my approach, is that it's based on interpretation and application of principle, not just using the same applications that were created in the past.
Yeah. What I said kind of early on is that because the principles seem to keep changing, I don't know if that's what it is at its core.
But in conservatism, I don't think the principles do change. It's still liberty, the value of human life, God-given rights. I don't know if the principles change that much. Let's take an example: the right to bear arms.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say that's a principle, and that goes permanently, and some say, well, it was just based on their local situation, their temporal situation. But I think if you look at that as a principle, it doesn't matter that they only had muskets then and we have AR-15s now. The principle is still, I should be able to own an AR-15 with very few restrictions.
Well, so here's what I would say. The principles that you spoke about 200, 300 years ago were called liberal principles. And the conservatives were the Burkeans and the royalists. And so
right.
So, what's called classical liberalism is now called libertarianism. And I think conservatives have moved past that, because what they've essentially argued is that, well, these principles are true most of the time, but they're not true all the time. They're not true when we want to maintain a social order, when we want to build a big military, or depending on whether you're talking about now or 30 years ago, when we're trying to fight off an invasion of immigrants.
I think I would argue that classical liberalism has become neoconservatism, because, classical liberalism, as you said earlier, is hawkish. And I think conservatism, my impression is that Kennedy was more like Newt Gingrich than he is like, name your favorite libertarian or progressive.
So when I say classical liberalism, are you hearing like Kennedy-Kennedian liberalism, or are you hearing like a 18th century like?
I'm hearing Kennedy.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. Yes. So classical liberalism is a technical term. So it refers to basically the kind of the attitude of that sort of political milieu of the founding fathers, kind of John Locke and those guys. And those guys were called liberals because they had this sort of different orientation. So that they would have sat on the left in the
well, I don't think they're socially liberal or socially libertarian. Were they?
Broadly, I think for the time especially. So Locke, for example, argued for religious toleration pretty broadly. He gave, with two exceptions, he argued that we shouldn't tolerate Catholics because they had a foreign prince, so they couldn't be impartial to in favor of the state. And also that we shouldn't really tolerate atheism because they weren't able to, they didn't have a motive to rule themselves properly because they didn't fear retribution in the afterlife. But basically that was the trajectory. So there were differences of opinion, and I think we can see that in our founding fathers. What we basically see with the founding fathers is a failure to apply their principles consistently. So they would say things like all men are created equal with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they didn't apply it to women. They didn't apply it to Native Americans. They didn't apply it to Black people. And also a lot of them are Federalists who didn't really believe in that we had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness all the time.
Well, right. Hamilton was such a strong Federalist. He thought only the elite should have the right to vote, the elite and educated, because the regular person could not, do a good job of that. I kind of blanch a little bit. I agree with you. When they said all men are created equal, I think many of them were abolitionists, but it was practically they couldn't keep the South united with us to fight against Britain. And so they left that till later. George Washington, a lot of them, he got rid of his slaves. But I think there was a growing awareness of the humanity of of blacks that was there. It's not that they didn't live up to them. They had to progressively implement it, and they couldn't do it all at once. Not everyone was like that. I think many of them were still probably racist. Were they thinking about involvement in society? Were they thinking about suffrage of, for women to vote? I don't know. Did they think of women as civic equals? Probably not. But did they want women to have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I think so. So I guess I don't see them as being hypocritical or not living it out. I see them as recognizing these principles and not being able to apply them immediately for practical reasons.
I think it's partly that. So I think there were some who were abolitionists leaning, but realized that we couldn't unite the colonies with a strong anti-slavery orientation. So what I would say is they were very progressive for the time, and so I don't want to say they were exceptionally bad people for the time, because 200 years from now, somebody if somebody were to pick up something that I wrote or said, they might say, wow, he really missed applying it here. You know what I mean? But what I would say is they were progressive for the time, but I think they still mostly missed applying it. I think they said a lot of things that were incredibly forward thinking, but they didn't necessarily apply it. And so at least not consistently. And maybe you couldn't have expected them to, just because we're kind of looking back, in hindsight. But I guess the libertarian experiment or thought process is trying to figure out, well, how do we actually apply this consistently?
Cody, I'd like to have some more discussions in the future about Christians and politics. I think there's a lot to explore. We talked a lot of them. I mean, just Christian support of Donald Trump, I think there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about that subject, but I mean, there are definitely more subjects here. Even the difference between libertarianism and conservatism is interesting. Like, I'd like to explore, okay, we both agree on minimal government, but we disagree on perhaps social norms or social,
Well, you could argue that we both agree on minimal government sometimes, just like libertarians and progressives agree on minimal government sometimes.
Well, I don't know if all libertarians are pacifist either. Maybe
no. A lot of them would say that would put violence on the individual. You have the individual right to self-defense, and so if you don't expect the state to do it for you, then you should be willing to pack heat and take care of things yourself. Now Christian libertarians may be different. There may be more of them who are pacifists, but generally speaking,
and maybe more of them who are pro-life also, because libertarianism in general does not want to make coercive legislation against abortion.
Yeah, I think part of the argument there is that it becomes very difficult to enforce. It becomes messy, because then do we want the state to investigate when an alleged miscarriage has taken place to make sure that it's not an abortion? There's also the sort of complicated factor of, the mother's body is involved here. And so I think that becomes complicated, right?
It does.
Yeah, and I think particularly when I've considered the possibility of moving to an anarcho-capitalist perspective, it's hard to imagine how that fits together with a pro-life viewpoint, because if you don't have the state at all, how can you really enforce legislation to protect the unborn at all? And so yeah, I think that becomes very, very messy.
Well, I mean, if you go so far as to say we don't even need community police, then we're basically talking about militias, and now we're back to factions and gang retribution, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, so it's either something that, like you ever watch like an old John Wayne movie where they call together a posse. So it could be that. You could also have private police. So in a lot of cases, maybe those would be provided by insurance companies. That you have these kind of night watchmen who help with certain things. But basically insurance companies have a vested interest in keeping crime down low, and so that maybe they would invest in private police as a means to kind of handle those issues when they come up in communities.
Well, that's almost like a capitalist solution, keep costs low and quality high by not having a government monopoly.
Yeah, which generally I love. Yeah. So anyway, well, I guess I kind of gave you your opportunity to say something to conclude with, but is there anything? I'd like to give you a final word if you want one.
I enjoyed talking to Chris. I think he's a little misinformed in being a progressive, but of course I would think that. But I like that he's a centrist, and I think to some extent even though I'm very conservative in a lot of ways, I'm definitely against state coercion. What I mean by that is I think the government can incentivize certain activities like through tax breaks and all that, but I don't think they should be redistributing my money on one hand. And to some extent, I think they should disincentivize other behaviors without necessarily making them illegal. So let's talk about regulation, labeling, and of like tobacco, alcohol, and firearms. I think that's totally appropriate. Should we be banning them? Probably not. I think, again, that's coercive. The more things we ban, the more coercive. I think we should really limit that on both ends and have incentives, disincentives, or regulation. But in the middle, we should permit as much as possible and get government out. And I guess that's kind of libertarian. And the only way I'm conservative is I don't know. I think we need to be preserving, the traditional family, and then that asks the question: well, how do we approach transsexualism or homosexuality, right, or gay marriage, or that's another discussion. And maybe I should be more. I think I might be more libertarian on that as well.
Well, thank you,
So
Dan.
I don't have a great summary, except that interesting decision, and it made me realize that that more balanced, reasoned, less extreme voices need to be raised up on both sides of the center.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to do this, and thank you, Chris, who's of course off now, but we appreciate him taking the time as well. It was a fun conversation. I enjoyed being able to chat with you both.